I'm Renata Gregorio with First Coast News, and we are here in Nassau County to speak with you about a death penalty trial that is happening right now. Some of you may remember this. It goes back to 2021. Well, things could end tomorrow, possibly, because that is when a jury of 12 people could be making a life-changing decision for one man. This jury will decide whether Patrick McDowell lives or dies. McDowell confessed and he pleaded guilty to the murder of Nassau County Sheriff's Deputy Joshua Moyers. That was in 2021. It was in Callahan in the middle of the night during a traffic stop when McDowell shot Moyers. Now he has confessed, and we actually heard testimony from him himself. We'll get a little bit more into that. But over the past 2 weeks, the jury has heard all of the evidence in this case. And the reason we want to talk to you about this right now is because the state and the defense have both finished. So what happens next is tomorrow the jury will hear the closing arguments, which, if you're unfamiliar with what this is exactly, it's when they encompass their whole pitch. The defense talks about all the evidence they've seen, that they've given their side of the story, and the state does the same, and then the jury will be given their instructions and will go to deliberate. We don't know how long it could take them, but if it does take a while, the judge told them today to pack a bag because they could be sequestered because this is a capital case. And so what a penalty phase is as well. This isn't a regular main part of the trial that you're used to. This is the penalty phase of the death penalty trial. So what that means is McDowell has already pleaded guilty. The jurors do not have to decide if he did the crime. They have to decide what his punishment should be. The threshold is actually lower now as well, because last April, almost exactly a year ago, last Saturday it was, the law was changed so that only 8 of 12 jurors are needed to recommend death in a death penalty case. Of course, the judge will have the final say, but that threshold is now lower. So let's start from the very beginning here. Patrick McDowell is facing a number of charges. The first-degree murder charge, that's where the death penalty part comes in. Also shooting a police canine, and then 8 counts of aggravated battery on a law enforcement officer. And at the very beginning here, I mentioned back in 2021 what happened then. You may remember there was the Deputy Moyers, and he was shot and killed, but it didn't end there. There was a nearly 5-day manhunt in which McDowell led law enforcement officers from all across the area on a manhunt on the run. For a while, he was in a wooded area. They had to search that whole area. They ended up eventually apprehending him in a Callahan baseball complex concessions area, but that wasn't for a while. And in between that period, we had schools going on lockdown. There was the police canine that was shot, that one charge that he is facing. So a lot happened right there. So the prosecution, they were the ones that went first, and this happened about almost 2 weeks ago. It was about a week and a half now. So the jury really has to think back to when that first happened also. They began, and then the defense, we didn't hear much from them in the first couple of days because they deferred their opening statements. The opening statements are where they go through all of the evidence. They say, this is what you're going to see. They lay out their side to the story. That first day, we actually saw the dash camera video of Moyers' murder. This was during testimony of an officer who was there, and if you watch the video, you can count down the seconds. It was less than 40 seconds that he arrived to the scene after Moyers had been shot. I'm gonna explain a little bit about what happened in that video. So it's on the dashboard camera of Deputy Moyers. He gets out of his car. You see him go up to this van. That is what McDowell is in. We later find out it was a stolen van, and he was in there with a woman. We also heard through the evidence that he had been doing meth in a parking lot of a gas station. That's where he originally saw Moyers, and he testified, McDowell did, that he actually acknowledged him with a head nod. So they had this interaction, and then McDowell testified that he believed he knew Moyers was going to follow them after that. So that does happen. Moyers pulls McDowell over. We see in this video they're talking for a few minutes, and then it's kind of out of nowhere. It was a very silent courtroom at this point that Moyers is heard on the camera asking if there are any firearms in the car, and then he is shot in the face and he falls, and then in the video you see McDowell reach out of the window and then shoot him twice more. At the same time, there's a railroad crossing that you can see that's right in front of the van, and you hear the train is coming, you see the arms going down, and then McDowell's car takes off. And then, as I said, less than 40 seconds later, another deputy arrives on the scene. We find out that this deputy, through his testimony, he says that he had driven up to 136 miles an hour to get there. And he knew Moyers, not just because he worked with him, he said he was his mentor, and Moyers was the first person he ever did a police ride along with. He said he was the person that really introduced him to the field. So this was a really big deal for him. You see a lot of people throughout this trial get emotional. He is the first person that we hear from, and we do hear that voice cracking, and we know what the situation has been like for him. You also see that on the video. You hear him kind of yelling, and it was very quiet in the courtroom when that happened. So some other people that we also heard from during the prosecution's part of all of this, we also hear from JSO K-9 unit, because you get the sense through the entire course of displaying of the evidence that this was a huge law enforcement effort. There were SWAT teams that they were naming from different agencies that I didn't realize had SWAT teams. They were all here trying to help because one of their own had been shot and killed, and now the person who did it was on the run. So in another video that we see, it's nighttime, and the police officers, it's the JSO K-9 unit, they have their flashlights, and you see the flashlights going on, but only for a little bit at a time because they say they don't want to give away their location. It's a little bit hard to see what's going on in the video because it's dark, and then what you hear is a dog because they let their K-9 out. They're in a wooded area. The K-9 going for McDowell. We find out that he actually did latch on to McDowell at one point, and then you hear some shots fired, and there's a little bit of chaos. The K-9 is actually also named Chaos, so I don't want to make that confusing. But we know that some of those K-9 officers fired back, and they say they did that because they were in fear for their lives. This is all coming out in the prosecution's witness testimony. We also know during this time, the woman who was in the van, she described herself as freaking out after McDowell shot Moyers. They eventually pull over and get out of the car. Both of their phones are off because McDowell had said to do that, he says, and she turns her phone back on. She calls 911. We hear that 911 video as well. Some other evidence that we see the guns that McDowell used. We see Moyers' uniform, the top half. And that was actually in the courtroom for a while. You can see some of the blood stains on it. And at one point, an attorney asked if they could move it so that the jury is not staring at it the entire time, the entire 2 weeks. Something else really big that happened during the prosecution part of all of this is the victim impact testimony. So if you're unfamiliar with what this usually happens in the capital murder trials where there's a death penalty involved, where they'll have usually the murder victim's family will come up and talk about how it impacted them and how their lives have been really changed. This is usually the most emotional part of a trial, at least so far. So what we had here in this case, we had Moyers is a deputy that he also worked with, as well as his parents and his brother and his fiance. Instead of his fiance speaking, a victim advocate spoke for her, reading what she had read. And so far in this case, this was the most emotional part that had happened. We heard the brother talk about his legs giving out when he first heard the news. He said that he was not able to hold down a job because he'd get so overcome with emotion and grief that he would have to leave. We heard from the mom. She read parts of her journal. She talked about how she would see other red-headed men around, and for just that instant, it would make her think of her son, and she'd have a breakdown there. She also spoke about how she's in physical therapy now because of the stress that it has caused on her body from her son's murder. His fiance was speaking about the proposal that Deputy Moyers had given to her. She talked about how he had surprised her and reserved a beach, and she called it the happiest day of her life. His father mentioned that he was an organ donor, so even in death he was able to continue to save people. So we also know after this happened, the defense attorneys filed for a motion for mistrial. The court documents show that jurors are actually not supposed to consider any of this. The victim impact testimony, really emotional stuff. Jurors are not supposed to consider that because it's not an aggravating factor, as it's called, and this is from the court documents. They also mentioned, the defense attorneys, that there were some jurors that were crying. There were people in the audience who were family members who were very upset. They were holding each other, but the judge decided that mistrial would not be granted. Things would go on. After that, the state finishes what they have done for their case. So after this, oh, and it's important to keep in mind as well, now that we are here at the end, the state had 2 days that they went over everything that they needed to for their case. The defense went over everything in 5 days, and some of those days were a little shorter, but now that we're towards the end, it has been a week since the jury has heard everything from the state's point of view. So they do have that all to consider in there. And the defense did call more witnesses. That was part of why it lasted a little bit longer. So the biggest thing, at least at first, to come out of the defense is McDowell testifying for himself. He was up on the stand for a good bit of time. I know in the trials that I've covered, most of the time if a defendant gets up there and speaks and apologizes, they aren't quite up there apologizing for as long as he does, at least in what I've experienced in the trials that I've covered. So he apologizes to Moyers' family, to his own family, to the Nassau County Sheriff's Office, to residents of Callahan who were in fear for their children, he says, during that time that he was on the run. And Moyers, he said that Moyers did his job well, so well, in fact, that he was able to take one look at McDowell and know that he was up to no good. That's what he said, testifying in court. He said what he had done was cowardly, and he explained his mind on meth, because if you remember, he and the woman who had been in his car said that they had been at a gas station doing meth just before this. We later find out that some of the doctors called it a meth binge because of how often he had been doing it up until this point. So he explained his mind on meth. He said that things that were illogical would seem logical to you then. And he thought that driving to the Florida-Georgia line to shoot guns in a stolen van in the middle of the night, which was their plan when they got pulled over by Moyers, was a good idea. But the biggest part was really that apology. And then when he apologized to his own defense attorneys, he said he was apologizing for what he was about to say. Then he reveals to the court that his first option when he got pulled over was to run. And the woman in the car convinced him that was a bad idea. So his second option was to talk his way out of it. But then when it became clear that that was not going to work, he says that he checked his gun to make sure that it was loaded because he was willing to do whatever it took to get out of that situation and get away, and that included shooting a sheriff's deputy. He said that he was only thinking of himself in that moment. We also heard from many of McDowell's own family members, and during this time the defense displayed a lot of pictures for the jury to look at from his childhood. At points they went over his childhood many times, showing a lot of different pictures. So those were on the screen and what the jurors were looking at during this time. They also testified that McDowell was different after his military service. So McDowell served twice in Iraqi war zones. The first time was with the Marines, and then when he got out of the Marines, it was right in 2008. And he just had a son, and he needed a good job. So he found this pretty lucrative job. It was with a private defense military company called Triple Canopy. He took that job, and we found out actually today, his grandfather explaining that he wasn't supposed to go back to Iraq. He was gonna go to Afghanistan, he said, but he ended up in another Iraqi war zone. And that was the worst of it as far as what he saw, according to the testimony that has come out about that. So, we heard from a number of military members, and this was a couple days actually that we only heard from other fellow Marines, and he was described as the perfect Marine. All of these military members saying that he would do everything by the book. He was a great leader. They only had praise for his character then. Then we heard about some of the really traumatic experiences, things that were happening in Iraq during that time, some suicides of some other of his military members, and we learned that it was his job to photograph some of these really intense scenes. We were told about one situation where there were two people who were in an armored truck and it exploded, and it was his job to go inside there and take pictures. That's what the evidence shows there. We also heard from people who were in Veterans Treatment Court and in the transitional housing afterwards, because after he got back from Iraq that second time serving with the private military company, he ended up getting into issues with drugs. That's how he ended up in Veterans Treatment Court, and we heard a lot about this as well. People explaining their personal conversations they'd had with him. He didn't really want to talk about what he had experienced then, but they kind of understood that because they were also veterans. So we heard from those people. We also heard during this time, this was this week and then a little bit into last week as well, we heard from some people who were also family members, and they said that they had been going over a Bible study with McDowell and that they'd really noticed a change in how he had been acting during that time. Some of the final people that we heard from today and yesterday are doctors, these clinical psychiatrists. So 3 of them are who we heard from on the defense's side, and each of them said that PTSD and that meth binge, which caused psychosis, were what McDowell was experiencing during the murder. The defense ended today with some emotion from the grandfather, so we've been hearing from all of the doctors doing their testimony, but then the final thing that the jurors heard before the defense rested their case was from the grandfather. They talked about him as a child when he got to go on a trip going, since his grandfather was a naval captain, he would go on the Navy ship. They got to go from Hawaii to San Francisco, port to port. It was a special trip. And he talks about just his time, how he still loves his grandson. And that is the end note for what the jurors have to consider. We also hear one of the last things the grandfather says is that he believes that McDowell, if he does not receive the death penalty, is able to work with other veterans, and he'll be able to change those people's lives so that they don't go down the same path that he does. So after this, the defense rests. We have a state psychiatrist come in, and he says that he does not agree with any of the doctor's statements saying that PTSD was a factor in the murder of Moyers. This person says that fight or flight was not a thing because the way fight or flight works, he says, is that it's impulsive, it happens in milliseconds, and it's just a rush of adrenaline. Whereas when he was watching this video, it was about 6 minutes that Moyers and McDowell were interacting before he shot him. So that is the last person that we heard from. We heard from all of the defense, all of the state first, laying out their case. Then we heard from the defense, which took a bit longer. Then the last person was the state again. Where we are right now is tomorrow, the jury will get this case. We're expecting them to get it a little bit before lunchtime or so. And throughout this whole case as well, I want to mention the demeanor of everyone. We've been seeing a lot of family members. Moyers' family members have been there the entire time. McDowell's family members have his father's been there for most of the time, and several other ones have been in and out. We've been seeing his ex-wife around a lot, but his demeanor, he's appeared pretty calm while in the courtroom, solemn at times, because a lot of people are getting really emotional here, especially when the Marines come in. They say how it's come out a lot in the evidence that, the Marines don't like to talk about this. They're taught to be, really strong, not really talk about their feelings like this a lot, and then many of them don't want to. But we've seen a few Marines breaking down up there on the stand as they recount their friends that took their own lives and just some of the trauma that they've experienced. So this is all going to be something that the jury considers. Of course, we'll be following it right here. We'll be coming to you on First Coast News throughout the rest of today, tomorrow, whenever you need to check on, see what is going on. We've been doing the live stream as well. But for right now, going to leave you with that. I'm sure it's a lot, but with the recap of this case, a lot to consider here in the past 2 weeks for the jury. I'm Renata Gregorio, First Coast News, on your side.